Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 42 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. If you have checked into your favorite media outlet lately, you've likely noticed that here in the United States, we have entered presidential primary season. Therefore, I thought it would be fun to have a chat with Heather Richardson, author of To Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party. Our conversation with Heather is fascinating. Just as she does in her book, Heather helps us chart the history of the Republican Party and the evolution of its ideology from the party's birth in the early American Republic through the presidency of George W. Bush. This conversation truly shows us how the history of our early American past has impacted and shaped our present-day world. Our chat with Heather begins with a discussion of objectivity. Historians always strive to be objective about the past, but I wondered, if you are researching the near past, such as 2008, and something as passionate as politics, how do you remain objective? Heather answers this question, and after we discuss her method, she takes us through the early days of the Republican Party and then reveals why, over the course of its history, the ideology of the Republican Party has swung between progressivism and conservatism. This is a long interview, so let's get to it. Let's go meet Heather Richardson.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Heather Cox Richardson is a professor of history at Boston College. She serves as the editor of We're History, a web-based magazine about American history that does, quote, serious history for regular people, end quote. Heather has authored 5 books, including Wounded Knee, Party Politics and the Road to an American Massacre, and, most recently, To Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Heather.
Thank you for having me.
We're excited to have you join us today because you have just written a book about the history of the Republican Party, and the United States is about to enter another presidential campaign cycle, which means it's only a matter of time before someone mentions that the Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln.
Well, certainly it's a good time to be talking about the Republican Party, and it is the party of Lincoln, but it is also the party of his enemies, and that's what's so much fun about doing the Republican Party, is it's gone through so many different cycles in its history. It really tells the story of America itself.
How did you come to research and write a book about the history of the Republican Party?
Well, I've always been interested in the contrast between image and reality in human life, and in America that really translates to the conflict between language and power. So my first book was actually on the Civil War because what I really wanted to understand was how the same men who had fought and sent their sons to die in the Civil War turned around and 20 years later were supporting big business. You know, had they really sold their children for the wealthy? So I wrote a book about the underlying economic ideas of the Republican Party, and then a book about Reconstruction, and then by then was studying the West, so I wrote a book about the West, and, it went on and on. And what I discovered is after my first 4 books, really I know the story of power and language in the 19th century better than probably anybody, and certainly with the way it has to do with politics better than almost anybody. And then I had taught throughout the 20th century. I teach a lot of 20th century courses, and of course you can't do the 20th century without doing politics. So it seemed like a natural thing to write, and I thought it would be easy, and boy, was I wrong about that, let me tell you. But once I got into it, it became not just a story of the Republican Party, but really a story about America, and it became absolutely all-consuming for a number of years for me.
To Make Men Free offers a history of the Republican Party from the 1850s to the end of George W. Bush's presidency in 2008. As historians, we try to be objective about the past and offer a non-biased interpretation of it. Heather, I'm really curious. Did you find it difficult to keep your objectivity as you wrote about the near past and other political events that you have witnessed during your lifetime?
You know, it's so funny. Some people have complained that, in fact, I'm not objective about the present. But the irony of it is that I am far more attached in a funny way to the 19th century than to the 20th. Those are the people I have lived with for the last 30 years. Those are the people I have incredibly strong feelings about because I know them so well. When I got to the 20th century, and actually I've always been good up through the 1920s, up until World War II, really. My fields of study are about 1820 through World War II, so that stuff is my wheelhouse. But when it came to the present and the things I had lived through, I had very strong ideas about them, but they were strong historical ideas. For example, I thought that Watergate was huge. I actually wrote the entire proposal around Watergate. And when I actually got into the material, I did it the same way I would do the 19th century. So, for example, you know, I read memoirs, I read letters, I read government dispatches, I read newspapers. I did the exact same thing that I would do in the 19th century. And what was interesting is the fun of what we do is that the people who emerge from our studies are not necessarily who they were when we went into them. So Watergate became actually kind of a blip. I don't want to say it's not important, but that was what got me into history, what was going on in Watergate. That was just when I became politically aware. And of course, it's hugely important for many reasons. But in terms of the trajectory of the Republican Party and maybe the trajectory of America, it's just not that big a deal. So what I found when I got to the present, what I did, certainly for things I'd lived through, what I did was I had to treat it at a distance. And what came out was not what I expected. The people I thought I liked, I ended up not liking. Some of the people that I expected to hate ended up actually rising quickly. And the other thing that I found was that because I knew that there were people alive through this present era after World War II, I sourced those chapters so much more thoroughly than I sourced the stuff before, because I knew people would come after me and say, oh, you didn't look at X, oh, you didn't look at Y. And what's really interesting to me about the people who've complained about the 20th century stuff is they make, blanket statements, oh, she's not clear, she doesn't know what she's talking about here, this is unclear. But nobody has come up and said, oh, she's got Eisenhower wrong because look at these documents. Oh, she's got George W. Bush wrong because look at these documents. What there has been is some pushback from the far right, the people I call movement conservatives, who cherry pick, especially they're very upset about Hoover. They like Hoover a lot. And they don't like that I have said that he was not up to the task of the Depression, which I just think is so far out there that it's not worth grappling with. But the sort of blanket statements of she's not as good in the 20th century as the 19th, nobody has actually come up with anything to disagree with. And I sort of feel like it's just sort of a way to say, we can't deal with this. And if there's one thing I have a good reputation for, it's my research. So all that, a very long way to say, I was worried about it. I think I way overcovered my bases. At one point, there's a 25-page chapter in the book that at one point had over 500 footnotes. And I finally just said, I've got to stop. I'm beating a dead horse here. This is what I think happened. People can disagree. They need to marshal their facts to do it. I'm just waiting for people to marshal their facts to do it.
Well, I certainly enjoyed the 20th century section of your book because I found that how I lived through some of the events I lived through occurred very differently than I thought they did. So I appreciated the research in there and thought it was well researched.
When you put George H.W. Bush in the context of the fact that the USSR broke apart and we didn't go to war with anybody except Iraq, and under some very bizarre circumstances, truly I had never thought of it that way. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, wow, I get this now in a way that I sure didn't get when I remember hearing that they were dropping missiles. That was a real mind bender for me.
Let's move away from the 20th century just for a few moments. Let's go back to the 19th century, to your people. How did the Republican Party get its start? What did the political landscape of the United States look like in the 1850s? And what platform or vision for the United States did the early Republicans espouse?
Well, what I have argued and what I think is right, actually, is that the Republican Party actually has its roots long before the 1850s. It forms in 1854 after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it really takes shape in the election of 1856. It doesn't really have a solid name by then, but that's when it's starting to form as a deliberate unit. And then, of course, Lincoln gives it its ideology in 1859, brings a lot of different ideas together. So that's really the heart of when you can say it is born. But it's certainly gestating all the way back to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And what I make a big deal about in the book is how the revolutionary fathers who put together the Declaration and the Constitution had a vision of what America was going to be. And the Declaration of Independence guarantees equality of opportunity for everybody, but the Constitution guarantees a protection of property. And when they wrote those two documents at very, very different times, it did not seem as if they were in contradiction, because the resources of this continent were, to their minds, so extraordinary that there would always be a place for men on the make to rise, to have equality of opportunity. And, as you know, one of the reasons that America, the colonies, complain about the rule of Great Britain is because they are not allowed to cross the Appalachian Mountains. And as soon as the war breaks out, Daniel Boone sneaks across the Appalachians, and he goes to the land of what was part of Virginia at the time, but what was the land of Kentucky. And he discovers this incredible western land that is so incredibly rich that anybody can rise, anybody can make it in his mind. And that's one of our first true American documents published directly after the Revolution, was the present state of Kentucky. It was by land speculators, but it talked about how rich and wonderful Kentucky was. So there's this idea that as soon as the war is over, if there is going to be any kind of class conflict or places where men can't rise, they can move west. And the problem with that is it becomes very clear early on in Kentucky that that's not the way the democratic system is going to work in Kentucky, at least, because Kentucky has inherited two laws from Virginia that really matter to democracy, and that is primogeniture, the idea that the oldest son gets everything, and slavery. So what happens is that because of primogeniture, which means that one man out of a family will take everything, leaving his brothers penniless, and because of slavery, which means that men get to monopolize other men's labor, what happens is that in Kentucky, you don't get the rise of a democratic government so much as you get the rise of a government where very quickly the men of means, the men who have inherited all their property or who have slaves, begin to control the political process. And when that happens, it's of significance for two reasons to the Republican Party. One is because one of the families this happens to is the Lincolns. Abraham Lincoln's grandfather, Abraham, for whom our Abraham Lincoln is named, is one of these families. He moves to Kentucky. He does very well in Kentucky, and he is killed by Indians. And when that happens, all of his fortune goes to his oldest son, Mordecai. That's Abraham Lincoln's Uncle Mordecai, who owns racehorses and becomes very wealthy. But Abraham Lincoln's father and his uncle never even learn to read. They become day laborers. Then when when Lincoln's father, Thomas, begins to work his way up, the slave owners who want all the best land in Kentucky begin to challenge land deeds. And because the courts are back in Virginia and because nobody who doesn't own slaves can really afford to have a good lawyer, men like Thomas Lincoln are forced out, and they're forced to cross the Ohio River. He goes to Indiana first. They end up in Illinois, but first he goes to Indiana. And that's the other reason that this is significant for the Republican Party. Indiana is covered by the Northwest Ordinance, which is the law passed by the Congress under the Articles of Confederation. And the Northwest Ordinance abolishes primogeniture and slavery in the lands that are north of the Ohio River, with the argument that those lands, as long as you keep out slavery and primogeniture, what you will end up with is true democracy. And that's the atmosphere in which our Abraham Lincoln is reared, the idea that every man should have equality of opportunity, and that slavery and primogeniture by then sort of falls off the earth but in America, but as long as you don't have slavery, every man is going to have a right to rise. Well, if you fast forward then to the 1850s, you get a scenario where the Congress, the Supreme Court, and the White House are controlled by Southern, Democratic, wealthy slaveholders. And what Lincoln and the men like him fear is that if those men get control of the government, And they will do so by taking over the American West. After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, America acquires a huge swath of land in the West. If slavery moves into that, the government will no longer be a democracy. It will become a world that protects only the very wealthy. If that happens, no longer will every man in America be able to rise, and American democracy itself will die. So what you have in a way in the 1850s is the story of Kentucky writ large across the nation. But the story of Kentucky writ large is really in a way the story of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, playing the tensions within them out over a national scale in the first half of the 19th century.
Abraham Lincoln becomes the face of the party by 1860, and he wins election to the presidency. How does Abraham Lincoln and his fellow Republicans implement their vision for America between 1860 and 1865?
Well, this is so much fun. This is actually one of the ways I got into the party, is working on the party, is that, so I just gave you this long spiel about how why there is this ideology of wanting to keep government out of the hands of wealthy slave owners because it will destroy the concept of democracy itself. Well, an ideology is fine, but what happens when the rubber hits the road? I mean, what are they really going to do with that? And the Republicans get elected in 1860, and the opposition leaves. I mean, not all of it. The Northern Democrats stay. But for the most part, the Southern Democrats leave, and they take their ideas with them. And the Republicans really don't have a program. They've called for a few things. They've called for the protection of all American industries, and they've had one law out there or one proposal out there on that, but they don't really have a program. And the first thing they have to do, of course, before Lincoln's even inaugurated, the southern states have started to secede, and Lincoln, as soon as he is sworn in, calls Congress into emergency session for July of 1861, and instantly they've got to raise money. Well, how are you going to raise money? The U.S. government has never done anything before. Previously, it's floated loans to raise money. During wars, it's asked states for money, but they have no system of federal taxation or any real way to get big money. So instantly, Congress has to face the idea of how does a major power raise money? And so they begin by putting tariff walls around the country to raise money on imports, but also by passing our first national taxation, including an income tax. That's a Republican measure, not a Democratic one. Everybody thinks it's a 20th century Democratic measure. It is not. It is a Republican measure from the Civil War. So they start by doing that, and then, as they raise this army that eventually is going to include more than 2 million men and fight this war that's eventually going to cost more than $6 billion, they get more and more confidence about the power of the federal government. And in order for people to pay these taxes, they feel like they've got to speed up the process of people rising. So they try and goose the economy, if you will, jumpstart the economy. They pass the Homestead Act of 1862 to put men on farms. They pass the Land Grant College Act at the same time to make sure that even people who are not from wealthy families can get good educations to enable them to use their labor better. They pass the Department of Agriculture to make sure people can get good farming information and good seeds. They change the system of American money so that we have national money and that the banks no longer rely simply on men of means, but that the currency relies also on the federal government, on regular people's ability to pay. They try and get people to go out west to the farms and the mines by chartering a national corporation, which has never happened before. It's a huge growth in power, in which they charter the Union Pacific Railroad Act and later the Northern Pacific Railroad Act. And finally, obviously, ultimately, they decide to take the federal power and use it to make sure that every man is going to have an equal right to rise in America, and they abolish slavery. So what they do during the war is they create a very activist government, an unprecedentedly activist government for America that is designed to guarantee that every man has an equal opportunity to rise. That's huge. It's a fundamental reworking of what the American government is supposed to do, and a fundamental reworking of the relationship between individuals and the government. It's transformative.
The Republicans revolutionized the way government worked and who it served, and Lincoln was a driving force behind the party and its ideas. What happens to the Republican Party and its vision after Lincoln is assassinated in April 1865?
Well, that's, in a way, the most interesting part of this story because so many odd things come together. Andrew Johnson is not at heart a Republican. He runs on the Union ticket with Lincoln in 64. He is at heart a Democrat who does not believe in the concept of a government that serves everybody. He believes in a government that serves only the members of a certain party, and he is a virulent racist. So the idea that the federal government could be working for everybody, as it was, the Republicans' programs were extraordinarily popular in the North, especially the education provisions of the Land-Grant College Act, but the Homestead Act as well. He is desperately opposed to these. So when he becomes president after Lincoln's assassination, Congress is not in session. That's a piece that most people miss. Congress is actually not in session, and it's not going to reconvene until December of 1865. So Johnson can do whatever he wants in the summer of 1865. And what he decides to do is to try and restore America to a condition that looks much like it did in 1860 before the war broke out. And with the exception that there won't be slavery. He doesn't like the idea of rich men owning slaves because he thinks that they're keeping poor white men down. He's happy to get rid of slavery, but he really has no interest in equal rights. He has no interest in a government guaranteeing that everybody can rise. He has no interest in a government that works for everybody because he knows if that happens, the Republican Party will destroy the Democratic Party for all time, and people like him are out of luck. So what he does is he instantly tries to recreate the antebellum government. And he does that by encouraging Southern white people to go ahead and retake their states and recreate governments that do very little. They're supposed to solely abolish slavery, repudiate the Confederate debt, and nullify the ordinances of secession, which says that you that not only that they made a mistake in seceding, but that you can't secede. So the idea is to make sure there's never going to be another war. But other than that, he's pretty happy with the way things were before the war, so long as there isn't slavery. And he's hoping the Democrats will come back. The reason this matters, not only because, of course, it's devastating for African Americans in the South and because it changes the course of Reconstruction, but because the Republicans can't participate in this. They are standing at the sidelines going, call us into session. You know, this is a national emergency. We should be working on this. And Johnson keeps going, no, I'm good. I got this one. Don't worry about it. So when Congress comes back into session in December of 65, Johnson says, good news, guys. I've reconstructed the Union, restored it, he calls it. All you have to do is seat the congressmen who have been reelected from the new southern states or the newly formed southern governments, and we're all good. Because if I hadn't done this, it would have cost enormous amounts of tax dollars to try and do anything different in the South, and that would have made Southerners, by which he obviously means only white Southerners, that would have made them angry, and that wouldn't have been a terrible thing. So I went ahead and took care of things, and we're good. And Republicans look at this and they say, you are nuts. We just fought a war that cost over 500,000 lives, over $6 billion. Our brothers and our sons and our fathers are dead. Our entire government has been completely reworked. We're not going to lose the peace. I mean, this is just not going to happen. So while they're trying to figure out how they're going to reconstruct the Union, they pass two laws that they consider uncontroversial. Sorry, they're two bills because they don't ever become laws in these forms. And what those things do, there is the Civil Rights Act and the Expanded Freedmen's Bureau Act. And what they do is they're an attempt to try and guarantee that African Americans in the South will have equality of opportunity. Because the southern states have passed what we call now black codes, as well as reworking their southern governments. They have essentially remanded slaves, former slaves, back into a form of quasi-slavery. They can't own weapons. They can't meet after dark. They can't sell things without permission. There's all sorts of things they can't do. So Congress tries to step into that and to say, no. They have civic identities. Here are things that everybody in the South, regardless of their previous condition of servitude or their race, are going to be allowed to do. And they think this is kind of a no-brainer, actually. And the other thing they do is they expand the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau was created in March of 1865 with the idea that the South was devastated, and African Americans and Euro Americans both were going to need help transitioning out of a slave economy into a free economy, just to be fed and to get jobs and to try and figure out their new world. And when the southern states refused to let African Americans testify in court, no southern state would do that, which meant they could also not sit on juries, which meant basically they could not protect their rights at all. When that happened, the Freedmen's Bureau takes on a new role unofficially in the summer of 1865, in which the military officers of the Freedmen's Bureau, it's under the War Department, they begin to hear testimony from African Americans, and they decide cases in favor of African Americans against employers or attackers about 68% of the time. It's obviously a very necessary thing, but white Southerners insist this is an overreach of the federal government. So what the Congress does in 66 is they expand the Freedmen's Bureau to say, you can have these courts. We can have federal courts. If African Americans can't testify in Southern courts, we'll make sure they can testify in some kind of court. It's going to have to be a national court because the states won't let them do it, so we'll have these national courts. And in addition to that, the Freedmen's Bureau will also guarantee, and this is the kicker, they will guarantee, according to population and poverty, the spread of common schools. So we're going to insert schools all over not only the South, but the border states as well. It was not written to be limited to any region, but because of the way that the formula worked, it would have been southern and border states. Primarily, northern states had good schools. Anyway, Johnson looks at these two seemingly uncontroversial laws that are designed to enable every person to be able to rise through schools, through being able to get their own land, to testify in court, to have civic identities, to do the same things that the Republicans had done across the North and the West during the Civil War. He looks at those and he goes, no, stop. I'm vetoing these laws, and I'm vetoing them for these reasons. And this is the crucial part of the formula of the Republican Party. Johnson brings it in, and Johnson says it. He says, using the federal government to promote individual opportunity is not good for the country. It is not something the government should do. What that is a redistribution of wealth. It's taking white, he argued, tax dollars and redistributing it through schools, through social welfare programs, through hospitals, through better roads. It's taking white tax dollars and it's redistributing them to lazy African Americans who refuse to work their own way up. It's a complete misreading of what's going on. It's a complete misreading of the actual needs of the South, which is completely devastated. But what Johnson does is he manages to turn racism and the growth of the federal government and the new freedom of African Americans into an anti-government formula that we are still operating with today. And that is what happens to the Republican Party. Johnson redefines what they've done, and once that opening wedge is into the political ideology of the 1860s, it gets picked up in a weird way I can tell you about in the 1870s, and by the 1880s, the Republican Party has switched around to the very positions that in the 1860s they fought against, that any kind of government activism was in fact a redistribution of wealth.
As you've mentioned, the Republican Party of Lincoln had worked to create a government that championed economic and political opportunities for ordinary men. But after Johnson, and definitely by the 1880s, it has changed its course, and it now supports economic and political interests of the elite and big businesses. So why does Theodore Roosevelt come in 1901 after the assassination of William McKinley and shift the Republican Party closer to what it looked like when Lincoln was president in the 1860s?
Well, I'm going to start by being flippant and say it's Teddy Roosevelt. He's such a maverick, who knows what Teddy Roosevelt's going to do next.
He has a big stick.
Yeah, exactly. I love the story about, I'm sure it's apocryphal, but somebody trying to print his autobiography and saying that they had to go out and buy more of the capital letter I because he'd used up all the I's. That, to me, is one of the most interesting pieces of the Republican Party history in terms of what's happening today. Because Teddy Roosevelt, and he's not the only one, Teddy Roosevelt is a member of a number of what I would call the class, if you will, of 1884. And what happens is by 1884, most Americans look at where the government is, which by the 1880s, it's very clearly working for big business. This is the central issue of the 1880s and the 1890s in America, is the fear that America has been completely taken over by the J.D. Rockefellers, by the Carnegies, by the robber barons as they were known, by the people who are using the government only to support big business with the argument that it's the big businessmen who create jobs and that everything will trickle down to everybody else, which is the extension of the argument that I just talked about Andrew Johnson making. Although Johnson was not making exactly that argument, that's how it gets turned around by the 1880s and the 1890s. Americans look at that in 1884, and what do? They elect a Democrat. They elect somebody who is not a Republican. And I can tell you about why that's so important, but Republicans are horrified. And at the same time, the older Republicans, the old guard as they will come to be known, recoil from that, and they decide that the way to combat the idea of the people electing a Democrat is simply to lock up the electoral system so that the Republicans will always win forever in perpetuity. One of the things they do, by the way, is let in 1889, 1890, they live in 6 new states in a year. People never talk about that, and it's hugely important. That's how we get North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Washington in a single year, which is astonishing. It's the largest number of states to come in at once since the colonies. While the old guys decide that what they need to do is they need to lock up the Electoral College forever and the Senate forever, the younger men look at what's happening around them and they say, this is not democracy. This is not what we believe America should be about. And you have Teddy Roosevelt, but in 1884, he does not look like he's going to be the leader. You have Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts. You have Robert La Follette fighting Bob La Follette from Wisconsin, and soon joining the throng is going to be Albert Beveridge of Indiana. And those 4 men are the ringleaders, but not the only men, younger men in the Republican Party who say, we don't really have a democracy anymore, we have an oligarchy. And this is not what America is supposed to be about. And they come from very different places, and they are very different people, but they do believe that the system is no longer working. So they're going to work from within the Republican Party. Crucially, in 84, when many people jump ship from the Republican Party and vote for Cleveland, Teddy Roosevelt disparagingly calls them the mugwumps. Lots of people jump from the party and basically lose power in the party. Roosevelt, Cabot Lodge, La Follette, Beveridge, they decide to stay within the party and reform it from within, so that the old guard is terrified by them. They try and hide them. They try and sink them. And even when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president, they basically guarantee he's not going to get anything through Congress. But once they become powerful within the party, people start to listen to them. People on the street start to listen to them. And I think you can make a very good case that even though Congress, under the old guard, when Teddy Roosevelt is president, doesn't actually change a lot of laws, changes a few, doesn't change a lot of laws, but Teddy Roosevelt once again begins to use the federal government for the people very powerfully through executive orders, through extra-legal conferences, through all sorts of means, the ones that are available to him. And he and the others create the momentum that is going to enable Woodrow Wilson, when the Republicans split the ticket in 1912, it's going to enable Woodrow Wilson to put in place a progressive government that was unthinkable, really even unthinkable, 15 years before. And I think it's the fact they're reforming from within the party because the party has such a lock on everything that they have the room to create a new progressive Republican Party from within rather than having the Democrats try and change them from without.
After Roosevelt's presidency ended in 1909, the Republican Party made 3 ideological swings between progressivism and conservatism, or between championing the political rights and economic interests of ordinary men and women to promulgating the interests of elite and big businesses. These shifts occurred with a conservative swing by the presidency of Woodrow Wilson between 1913 and 1921, a shift back to progressivism with Dwight D. Eisenhower between 1953 and 1961, and then again back to conservatism from Nixon through George W. Bush. Heather, could you provide us with a brief explanation of why the Republican Party has swung between progressivism and conservatism?
Yes, I hope so. What I have come to believe is that there is a fundamental tension in America between the idea of equality of opportunity and the idea of the protection of property. Now, people who complain when I say that insist that I'm talking about collectivism, that I'm arguing for collectivism. And in fact, I'm not. The those two things are extraordinarily valuable for American society. They give us a unique sweet spot of both innovation and social welfare. And unfortunately, we almost never hit that sweet spot. We dance around it on either side of it. So I think there is, at first, an ideological reason that the party has swung back and forth, because Americans swing back and forth. Why the party does it is partly a reflection of that ideological swing, but it is also partly an issue of individual political power. Who's in power? Who wants to be in power? Who's got the money? And how does the money versus the people consolidate political power? And that's a really intricate and a really fascinating story. But if I can take a step in between those two poles, between the individuals and the society, and look just at the party, the swings of the 20th century are absolutely fascinating, and they're incredibly interesting from a historical point of view as well as from a modern point of view. So what happens is that, of course, you've got Roosevelt and his people talking about creating a progressive government, but there is, of course, Roosevelt's extraordinary ego tied into that, so that when he joins the Progressive Party, which breaks off of the Republican Party, he is calling for things that nowadays would not even let him into the Democratic Party, not even into the far left of the Democratic Party, practically. He's so far on the progressive side. And so you've got that coming into the 20th century. And after Woodrow Wilson, who no one really pays a great deal of attention to why the Republicans turn against Wilson the way they do, and everybody focuses on the League of Nations Treaty, which happens toward the end. In fact, they really go sour on him instantly, not only as a Democrat, not only was his father a Confederate minister, but also the first thing he does is he calls Congress into emergency session and he tells the Republicans that they're going to have to deal with the fact he is throwing over their signature issue. He's not getting rid of it. He's lowering the tariff, which they insist is the only thing standing between America and the apocalypse. That the tariff protects big business, and if you hurt the tariff, which is extraordinarily unpopular among workers and consumers, if you hurt the tariff, you're going to destroy America. So even before Congress is officially in session, it's in an emergency session right then, they've turned against Wilson, and they just hate him more every single minute. So by the time Wilson's administration is over, between Wilson's progressive legislation and then World War I, the progressives in the Republican Party are shattered. And what happens in the 20s is, I love the 20s, because what happens in the 20s is the Republican big business vision, the idea that as long as you protect big property, as long as you protect big business, as long as you protect the very wealthy, you're going to create this utopia where business is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's going to be more and more jobs, and people are going to make more and more money, and you're absolutely going to get rid of poverty forever. And they really believe this. I mean, some people maybe don't, and they know it's a scheme, but most people in the Republican Party really think this is true. Certainly Hoover does, the president who is most associated with this theory, but so does Calvin Coolidge and maybe Harding, whatever Harding believes aside from the bridge table and the booze and the women. They really think this is the right way America should work. You protect big business, you protect money, and they're going to take care of everybody else. And you have in the 20s this period when the Republican ideology is absolutely in place, and everybody thinks it's working brilliantly. It is great. Go be bullish on America, they say. It's, as long as you are participating in this great new scheme and working your way up, America's going to just make everything perfect for everybody. And then October of 1929 hits. And the Republicans have nothing to pick up. All of their vision of the world has just collapsed, and it has taken the world into the largest depression it has ever known. It's just no one knows what to do with it. And what happens then, of course, is that FDR steps in and recreates an activist government, but he does so with a very different sort of set of arguments than the Republican Party had created a progressive government under Lincoln and under Roosevelt. So he does that, and the Republicans have two options. They can either refuse to admit that anything they did in the 20s was wrong, and there's a branch of the party that does that. That's the Taft Republicans. But then there's another branch of the party, the Dewey Republicans, who say, you know what, you're right. The government has to take the sharp edges off of big business. It's going to have to regulate the economy, or we're going to end up with another depression. And they just don't like the way the Democrats do it. They say, we can do it better. They're going too far to the left. We can continue to build America and just use the government to make sure everybody has quality of opportunity. They very much go back to the language of Roosevelt and of Lincoln. And what happens coming out then of the New Deal is the battle we have going on nowadays. At first, it just seemed obvious that the Dewey Republicans were going to win. And Eisenhower is, of course, the quintessential Dewey Republican. It always infuriates me when people treat Eisenhower like he's Elmer Fudd because, he did something. Oh, I know, he won World War II. I mean, the guy was not stupid. I've read his memoirs. I've read his letters. I've read his dispatches. I've read, anything I could get my hands on. Really, really, really smart guy. And he played the bumbling role only when he was trying to buy time or to create a coalition so that nobody felt like he was denigrating their contribution to something. He's a really brilliant man. Eisenhower's middle way was enormously popular. It was so popular that it was really unquestioned. People nowadays complain about the way the 50s looked, but at the time, the GDP is off the charts. The compression of wealth that we now talk about, the window of wealth disparity gets very small. People are, generally America becomes in many ways the middle class nation it has tried to be. And Eisenhower, there are many people you can argue now are excluded from that, but Eisenhower worked very hard to do things, for example, like desegregate. He is the president who puts Earl Warren in charge of the Supreme Court, and people make a lot about the comment he made later about how he wasn't happy about the Brown v. Board decision of 1954. But in fact, Warren had been in California for the Lemon Grove decision, which was a Mexican-based decision, a Mexican-American-based decision that came out with the same argument that the Warren Court's going to come out with in Brown v. Board, and Eisenhower knew that full well. He knew what he was doing. He tried to desegregate Washington, D.C. by withholding contracts from any business that segregated its workers or that wouldn't allow African-American customers. He really did work to create equality of opportunity not only across America, but also across the world. And as we know, that doesn't always pan out. But Eisenhower was terrified that if, in fact, people began to feel dispossessed from their societies, they would be susceptible to following dictators, either religious or political extremists, who would promise people that they could return to a world where they had power, either culturally or economically. And if that were the case in a world that had nuclear weapons, they literally could destroy the earth. So Eisenhower really believed the American government had to be responsible for creating a future for everybody, equality of opportunity. And it looked like that branch of the party was going to be triumphant. But through a series of weird personal and political events, that's going to break down. What breaks that Eisenhower coalition down much more effectively even than that, though, is the use by the Taft Republicans, the people who become the movement conservatives, of racism. They pick up that same argument that Andrew Johnson made way back in 1866, and they say, oh, no, we told you that if you used an activist government, it was going to use white tax dollars to help lazy African Americans. And look what's happening at Little Rock. When Eisenhower sends the troops into Little Rock in 1957, that's exactly what they say. And it gets picked up not only by the far right, it gets picked up by the National Review, which is formed in 1955 under William F. Buckley Jr. to go ahead and push the Taft Republican line. And the reason they do that is they believe that an activist government that does anything other than promoting Christianity and big business is going to regulate business. And the actual regulation of business in any way, through minimum wages, through minimum hours, through anything that inhibits an employer's ability to do whatever he wants with his business, that in their minds is a redistribution of wealth, and they equate it to communism with a capital C, the spread of worldwide communism. And by opening that wedge in America through race, that branch of the party begins to take over by the 1960s from the Eisenhower Republicans and with the power of Goldwater in 1960 and then in 1964, pulling the Deep South states from the Democrats into the Republican Party with Goldwater in 64. By 1968, you've got Nixon desperately needing to keep at least some white Southern racists on board, and he courts Strom Thurmond in that election of 68 and starts a Southern strategy. And from there, this whole formula of an activist government helps lazy, at first, African Americans, but Nixon is going to expand that to include anti-war protesters, feminists, anybody who is not on the Nixon team. That language of division, that language that any kind of an activist government supports ne'er-do-wells that we don't want to have participate in America, that takes over American society until you get 1980, the election of Ronald Reagan, who says those things, but he says it with a genteel sheen. And from Reagan, then you get, of course, George H.W. Bush, who is much more an Eisenhower Republican, and then finally George W. So that trajectory takes us back, if you will, to Reconstruction, that what breaks the idea of a progressive American government is racism and dislike of immigrants. That's something we haven't talked about, but racism and xenophobia. And once you can convince enough voters that an activist government is not working for them, it's working for those people, then big business once again takes over the American government and it begins to protect property again.
I would like to explore the link you mentioned between civil rights and communism a bit more. Heather, would you help us understand how and why movement conservatism linked civil rights with communism, and whether this link can help us explain and understand why the United States still struggles to realize the free and equal society promised in the Declaration of Independence?
The link between civil rights and communism is actually a linchpin in American society. And one of the things that's fun about doing the history of the Republican Party and doing the history, therefore, of America is that that link is laid down formally in 1871, before the Bolsheviks are even born, and informally in the 1850s. And it's going to morph slightly, but the words are going to stay the same. And what the argument is developed by the slave owners and people like James Henry Hammond, who say that the way a good society should work is a very few wealthy, educated, in their cases white men, should run society because they're the only people who really know how to make things work, who really know where to plant the right crops, how to make a business work, who really know how to create the engine of the American economy. They're educated, they're well-read, they're well-traveled, and they argue in the 1850s that obviously God thinks they should be in charge of everything because they're fabulously wealthy as well. So they create this idea that a true, good, healthy society blessed by God is one in which the very wealthy direct the labor of everybody else, whom the people in the 1850s called mudsills, which was the pieces of wood driven into the ground, into the mud to support the higher edifice. So the vast majority of people, they say, are kind of dumb, and they basically just want to have good food and to sleep and to party and to, not really use much mental capacity. They're good for menial tasks, but really they're not good thinkers. And the key to this for American politics, obviously it has repercussions for slavery, it has repercussions for concepts of work, it has all kinds of major impacts on American society. But in terms of politics, the kicker to that argument is that you must never let the mudsills, the workers, have a political voice. Because if you do, what they will do is they will want to have more of the wealth that they're producing. They're going to ask for a better distribution of wealth, a redistribution of wealth, if you will, which will mean that the very wealthy will not have so much. They won't be able to continue to direct society and to create progress and to build new concepts and to get good educations and to think great thoughts, because they're going to have to work as well. And so society is going to slow down and be dead in the water, because if you let the mudsills, the workers, have a say in society, they're going to redistribute wealth. They're going to call for redistribution of wealth. Well, of course, Lincoln and his people look at this in the 1850s and they say, you're crazy. We're the mudsills and we're really smart, and we actually understand that what the government should do is work for everybody, and that's going to be better for everybody, for us all to work our way up together. And that's where things happen in the 1860s, that the Republicans simply use the government to help everybody. But that argument that the slave owners made is the one at the root of the new construction that Andrew Johnson builds in the 1860s when he vetoes Republican legislation trying to use the government to help everyone to rise. And he says that the using the government for education, for homesteads, for new roads and hospitals, those sorts of things, are exactly what James Henry Hammond and other slave owners warned about, that if you let the government do that, if you let the government work for everybody, what's going to happen is people are going to vote for policies that require money. And in order to pay for those policies, for the contracts that build hospitals or roads or schools, in order to do that, you're going to have to tax people. And the people who are going to be taxed are the people who have money. Therefore, an activist government is going to be a redistribution of wealth. Well, out of 1866, then, by 1867, you get the Military Reconstruction Act, which calls for African Americans to vote for the first time in American history. And then in 1870, you get the 15th Amendment, which guarantees African American voting. And in the South, white Southerners insist that the worst fears of the slave owners have come to pass, that you've got workers, not only African Americans, that's what they're really concerned about, but also poor white workers. But what they're really talking about is black people, black men. You've got workers voting, and they are using their votes to put in place a government that is building schools and roads and houses and so on, and taxing white people to do that. Obviously, they're not putting the taxes according to race, but that's the way the language goes. And so in 1871, you get a major movement across the South, primarily centered in South Carolina, that are called Taxpayers movements, where they say, listen, we don't have any problem with African Americans on a racial basis, which is complete crap. Of course they do. They've been very vocal about it. They say, but it's not about race. It's about the redistribution of wealth. We're against communism. And they get that word communism from the Paris Commune from March through May of 1871. The communards take over the city of Paris. And the way that story plays in America is that workers have taken over the government, and they are actively using it in the city of Paris to redistribute wealth. And they're killing priests, and they're killing wealthy men, and they're deliberately guaranteeing that workers will get more than their share of the wealth, according to the way American newspapers spin it. This is a big issue in America because of the timing with black voting, and also because in 1870, in New York actually goes to a Democratic government rather than to a Republican in the election of 1870, and that really matters because looking forward to the 1872 election, New York has 35 or 36 electoral votes, way more than anybody else. So if you can control New York, you pretty much control the White House, or so it looks in 1871. So in 1871, northern white people are very susceptible to the idea that if you let workers vote, as they do in New York City, voting for Democrats and taking New York to the Democrats, if you let workers vote, you are going to have a redistribution of wealth, and they're going to destroy American society. So that idea of communism and race gets linked in America very, very powerfully in 1871, and then it becomes a key player in the election of 1872. So that setup is there, that idea that if poor people vote or workers vote, they will vote to redistribute wealth. That becomes a key part of the American lexicon in the 1870s, and it's used throughout the 19th century. Then, of course, Roosevelt throws that in the teeth of big business and says that's not what's happening, but it gets picked up again in the 1920s and in the 1930s after the Depression. When the Depression hits, and Congress holds hearings about why the Depression is hit, a number of people actually testified before Congress that the problem is not the deregulation of the financial industry. It's not the corruption on the stock market. It's none of those things. It's the grasping nature of American workers, especially people like teachers and public workers who are sucking tax dollars out of hardworking Americans and are therefore redistributing wealth. And the only way to combat that, they say, is to cut the salaries of people at the very bottom of the scale, that they're the problem and the reason that the economy has collapsed. So that link between communism and workers' voting and race gets laid down in the 1870s. Of course, with the Bolshevik Revolution in the early 20th century, that's the language that they pick up and use, again, as I say, during the Depression. And then with the spread of communism to China immediately after, in the middle of the 20th century, that language becomes incredibly powerful because Americans, especially after World War II, are terrified that the next country to fall, each country that falls is going to threaten America. And that's where you get things like the John Birch Society, where the actual novel about John Birch said that, in fact, the American government knew that China was going to fall to communism, and John Birch was a whistleblower, and the government had him taken out rather than listening to him. So there is this idea that communism is not just the idea of world communism with its actual ideology as it played out in Russia and China, but that in America, communism is simply a redistribution of wealth when workers demand more of a share of what they've produced. After China and Russia in the middle of the 20th century, that coinciding with the liberation movements around the world, and especially with the civil rights movement in America, adds more teeth to the idea that if you let poor people, especially poor black people, vote, they're going to vote to redistribute wealth, and they're going to bring communism to America. And that was one of the key tenets of the John Birch Society in America, was that communism was coming into America, and you could see it through the civil rights movement, that you actually could see the fact that communists were infiltrating America by trying to get African Americans to demand voting rights, to demand rights in America. And the minute African Americans had rights, what they were going to do is they were going to use their power to put in place a government that was going to redistribute wealth. So it's a pattern that starts before the Civil War. It gets codified in language in the 1870s. It gets picked up again during the Depression, and then it gets picked up again in the 1960s and carries through to the present when we talk nowadays about makers and takers and people who are reliant on the government and who are working 3 jobs, but somehow they're not the ones contributing to American society. We're almost at a caricatured position of what the slave owners laid down in the 1850s or Johnson reformulated in the 1860s.
Our past is always with us, isn't it?
It's astonishing. And you know what? It's not even that far past if you think about it.
Let's transition to the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Now, Heather, your time warp question is also a listener question. I really enjoyed reading To Make Men Free. It presented a lot of history in a very digestible and easy to read way. It also prompted me to think of many different time warp questions. Unable to decide, I asked for help. I posted a poll in Poor Richard's Club, the social community for Ben Franklin's World listeners on Facebook, and they overwhelmingly voted for me to ask you this question. In your opinion, what might have happened if John Wilkes Booth hadn't shot and killed Abraham Lincoln? Would the Republican Party have avoided the ideological shifts between championing the rights of ordinary men versus those of elite and big business? Or would these shifts simply have manifested later than 1865?
Well, that's a terrific question, and it's a fun question for me in part because it gets to what I think was one of the key turning points in American history that nobody knows about, and it's this. If Lincoln, so you got to give me also that Lincoln's going to live throughout his entire second term, which, frankly, if you look at pictures, I'm not sure he would have made it. But if you give me a second term for Lincoln, what you would have had is this. If Lincoln had not died, Johnson never would have become president, and you never would have had a split between Congress and the president after the Civil War. Lincoln was a master at creating coalitions where they really didn't exist beforehand. He was a political master at that, and he would have kept the Republican Party together. So what they would have done is this. They would not have permitted the South to regroup the way they did in the summer of 1865. What they would have done was they would have continued to use the federal government the way I talked about before. Congress tried to in 1866 to use the federal government to create equality of opportunity for everyone to rise in the South as well as in the North and the West. What they would have done, and this is the turning point in American history, the great lost opportunity, is they would have guaranteed that there were schools across the South and the border states beginning in 1866 at the latest. Common schools for everybody. They would have brought education to everybody in the South, both at the lower levels and at the upper levels. Now just stop for a minute and imagine if the South had had as good an educational system as the North did beginning in the 1860s. So that would right there have dramatically changed the entire nature of America from that point going forward. Now that being said, they also would have continued to use the federal government to protect equality of opportunity. And what that would have done down the road would have been not ever to let the government get taken over again by the very wealthy. That they would have put in place, and I'm speculating here, of course, but by the 1870s, late 1870s, they would have had business regulation of some sort or financial regulation of some sort in place. And in order to back that up, I'll just say that the language of the passage of the 1864 Union Pacific Railroad Act is very different than the language of 1862, when they're starting to realize they might have a problem on their hands by throwing everything on the idea that people who run a big business are going to be civic-minded, which is what they think in 1862. By 64, they're not so sure of it because they're very concerned about the rise of financiers and the manipulation of the stock markets and the money markets. So I think by 1870, you would have had business regulation. It would never have been, we would probably still have had the swings between the Declaration and the Constitution at some level, but the Republican Party, when Lincoln and the people of his generation formed it, they very deliberately formed it to be the political arm of the Declaration of Independence. And that would have been the driving force of the Republican Party from then on. And I just don't think we would have had the swings we still live with. We would have written business regulation directly into the concept of a government that served everybody, not just one group or another. And the course of American history would have been a lot less bumpy. So that bullet and how it went on to affect American education, the American government, American economy, and American finances is extraordinary. Without that bullet, we would be living today in a very, very different country.
Wow. And that's all I can say about that. It's a very different future than the present we're living in now. So, wow.
Well, there's so many fun what-if moments, I have to say, when you do this kind of stuff, because you do get to know your people so well, and you think, if you could only just have done X. But that one, for me, the veto of the bill, and they rewrite the expanded Freedmen's Bureau, and everybody knows what's in the expanded Freedmen's Bureau bill. But what gets stricken out is the education provisions. And that's actually when they create the Department of Education instead, hoping that they can model a new system not on the Land-Grant College Act, but on the Department of Agriculture Act. And everybody thinks the Department of Education starts in the 1890s. It doesn't. It's actually formed right then, but it does nothing until much, much later on. And you just think, man, if we had had schools across the South from 1866, right there, aside from anything else, what would this country look like? And it would certainly not look like it does today, with Mississippi and Louisiana consistently vying to be the bottom of our educational system.
Before we conclude, would you tell us what aspect of history you are researching and writing about now?
Well, I'm actually doing a couple of things. I'm writing a lot, as you know, in popular magazines, but The two scholarly things I'm working on is I'm doing a graphic novel of Reconstruction, which is a great deal of fun, and I'm writing on a more scholarly level what I'm calling an intellectual history of American politics. It's called The Significance of the West in American History, and it's trying to redefine, if you will, the creation myths of America by dividing them between the East and the West and talking about political language over the course of American history. It's kind of a thought piece, but it's a lot of fun because it takes me back to my American studies roots. You know, I was trained not in American history, but in American civilization under David Donald, and lets me look again at literature and to put together literature and concepts and letters and newspapers. At the same time, I look at the impact of those ideas on, as I say, the rubber hitting the road in the Electoral College and how American political language plays from the beginning until, well, today. So it's a broad sweep, but it's a lot of fun.
For those of us who would like to continue this conversation and probe you a bit more about the history of the Republican Party or learn more about your work, where's the best place to learn more about you and how to get in contact with you?
Well, I do have an author Facebook page on Facebook, and I also use my personal Facebook often for professional stuff, so academics can find me there. My author page is at Heather Cox Richardson. I also am on Twitter at _H_C_Richardson. And my email you can get just by Googling Heather Cox Richardson here at Boston College. I also have a Tumblr, although I tend to write there largely about the craft of writing. So I'm actually not terribly hard to find. I am very much into the idea of intersecting between the public and the academy, and so I'm often hanging out on Twitter or on Facebook trying to figure out what people are interested in and what's worth writing about.
And no one will need to Google you because I'll include links to all of those places in the show notes page for this episode.
Terrific.
Thank you so much for taking the time to take us through the history of the Republican Party.
It was a great deal of fun. It's great stuff, isn't it?
It's a lot of fun, and it's a great book. What struck me most about Heather's book and our conversation is just how extreme the shifts in the ideology of the Republican Party have been. It makes me wonder, now that the party seems to be on a conservative extreme, will its ideology start to swing back towards progressivism? I don't know. Our chat with Heather also makes me wonder if the Democratic Party has experienced the same ideological shifts throughout its history. As I'm sitting here thinking about it, I can definitely see an extreme shift between the conservatism of the party during the Civil War towards the progressivism of the party during the presidency of FDR. I need to look for a historian who can discuss this so we can see if there are any similarities between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. You can find more information about Heather, her excellent book, To Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/042. Do you like convenience? If you do, text BFWorld to 33444 and you'll never have to remember to visit the show notes page again, because each week, the Franklin Gazette will bring the show notes right into your inbox. And when you sign up, you'll also receive access to Poor Richard's Club, the Ben Franklin's World community on Facebook. Just a reminder, this Saturday, August 15th, is our first ever Ben Franklin's World meetup. If you happen to be a last-minute planner, no worries. You can purchase tickets online until the tour starts, or you can purchase them in person. You can find more details about the tour as well as how to purchase tickets by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/meetup. Finally, did anything about the big history picture of the Republican Party that we just experienced surprise you? If so, what surprised you the most? Send an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or leave a comment either on the show notes page for this episode or in Poor Richard's Club.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.